bunch of Irish girls to live with. God knew they were all over the place. She was a nurse in training at Montefiore and lived in hospital housing with a colored girl, also a nurse. Was that the way it was for the Irish? Because he'd dated a Russian girl for a while, and the only people she hung around with were other Russians. "I'm Irish too," Stanhope said. "But back a ways." That was another thing about America. Everyone was Irish, but back a ways. Might be a sign of intelligence, keeping away from our lot, Frances said with a straight face. It took Stanhope a minute. At graduation, Mayor Lindsay stood at the podium, and from his third-row seat, Frances thought about how strange it was to see in person a man he'd only ever seen on TV. Frances had been born in New York, was taken back to Ireland as an infant, and had returned just before his 19th birthday with $10 American and citizenship. His father's brother, Patsy, had picked him up from JFK, taken Frances's duffel from his hand and thrown it on the back seat. "Welcome home," he'd said. The idea of this teeming foreign place as home was mystifying. On his first full day in America, Patsy put him to work behind the bar at the pub he owned on 3rd Avenue and 80th Street in Bay Ridge. There was a framed shamrock over the door. The first time a woman came in and asked him for a beer, he'd taken out a highball glass and set it down in front of her. "What's this?" she asked. "A half beer?" She looked down the row at the other people sitting at the bar, all men, all with pints in front of them. He'd shown her the pint glass. "This is what you want?" he'd asked. "The full of it?" And understanding, finally, that he was new to the bar, new to America, she'd leaned over to cup his face, to brush the hair off his forehead. "That's the one, sweetie," she'd said. One day when Frances had been in New York for about a year, a pair of young cops came in. They had a sketch of someone they were looking for, wanted to know if anyone at the bar recognized him. They joked around with Patsy, with Frances, with each other. When they were leaving, Frances mustered up some of that American inquisitiveness. How hard was it to get on the cops? How was the pay? For a few seconds, their faces were inscrutable. It was February. Frances was wearing an old cable sweater that had been Patsy's, and felt shabby next to the officers in their pressed jackets, their caps that sat rightly atop their heads. Finally, the shorter of the two said that before becoming a cop, he'd been working at his cousin's car wash on Flushing Avenue. Even when it all went automated, the sprayers would get him, and in the winters he'd end the day frozen through. It was too brutal. Plus, it was a lot better telling girls he was a cop than telling them he worked a car wash. The other young cop looked a little disgusted. He'd joined because his father was a cop, and 2 of his uncles, and his grandfather. It was in his blood. Frances thought about it through that winter, paying more attention to the cops in the neighborhood, on the subways, moving barricades, on television. He went to the local station house to ask about the test, the timing, how it all worked, and when. When Frances mentioned his plan to Uncle Patsy, Patsy said it was a sound idea. All he needed was 20 years, and then he'd have his pension. Frances noticed that Patsy said, 20 years, as if it were nothing, a mere blink, though at that moment it was more than the length of Frances's whole life. After 20 years, as long as he didn't get killed, he could do something else if he wanted. He saw his life split up into blocks of 20, and for the first time he wondered how many blocks he'd get. The best part was he'd still be young, Patsy said. He wished he'd thought of it when he was Frances's age. After graduation, his class had been split into groups to do field training in different parts of the city. He and 30 others, Brian Stanhope among them, were sent to Brownsville and then to the Bronx, where the real job began. Frances was 22 by then. Brian was only 21. Frances didn't know Brian well, but it was comforting to look across the room at muster and see a familiar face. Nothing, so far, had happened the way they'd been told things would happen. The station house itself was the exact opposite of what Frances had imagined when he decided to apply to the police academy. The outside was bad enough, the facade chipped and peeling, covered in bird shit and crowned in barbed wire, but inside was worse. There wasn't a surface in the place.